You're welcome back. Well, our mandate is to collect taxes, not grant waivers to taxpayers. This is becoming a very common statement these days, and that's since the Federal Inland Revenue Service responded to the issue of tax waivers, which began when the Senate Committee on Finance rejected the 6 trillion naira tax and import duties waivers proposed by the federal government in the 2023 budget, stating that wastages and leakages must be blocked. And yes, in the TES report for 2019, it was stated that the federal government had forgone revenue of about 4.2 trillion naira from two main sources, CIT and VAT. Now, finding a balance between the pros and the cons of tax waivers is what we'll be discussing next. And we're doing that with Taiwo Yedele, his partner and tax leader with PwC, joining us virtually from London. Good morning, Mr. Yedele. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Good morning, Ini. It's a pleasure to be on your program.
Yeah, so this conversation about tax waivers, obviously it has its own benefits. But the Senate coming up to bring it up at this time and say this is not the time for it. You tell us, you are the professional when it comes to tax. There was a reason why tax waivers were created, and it has its own purpose. And then now they are terming it as wastages. What do you see?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think maybe the starting point is to try and understand what this means. So tax waivers come in different forms. You can have a tax holiday, you can have exemptions, you can have deductions. So this is really whatever government says you can do that reduces the taxes you otherwise would have had to pay. So there's a provision of the Fiscal Responsibility Act that requires that government needs to report, we call it tax expenditure. Government needs to report how much government is, losing in quote to tax waivers and incentives. So in the 2023 to 2025 medium-term expenditure framework and fiscal strategy paper, the finance minister had presented this as part of the breakdown. And it shows that the tax waiver for 2021 was about 6.7 trillion. Now for the lawmakers saying that they reject it is curious for me, because on one hand, the tax waivers were to meet government policy objectives. And if you do a breakdown of the 6.7 trillion waiver for 2021, actually about 4 trillion out of it relates to VAT. The biggest portion of that VAT is the waiver of VAT on fuel. So I don't know whether the lawmakers understand that what they're saying is that we should now put VAT on petrol, on diesel, and all of that. You have a lot of those exemptions. Some of them are to do with the common external tariff under the ECOWAS protocols. We're going to have more now under the African Continental Free Trade Area. You cannot sign a treaty with the rest of the world and then decide that you're going to ignore it. So you have import duties, which is about 1.8 trillion out of that amount. VAT, local and import VAT is about 3.9 trillion. And in fact, companies' income tax is only 548 billion, because I saw a report by Punch saying that government granted waivers of 16 trillion to Dangote, Honeywell, and others, which is quite misleading because that's not correct. The component of CIT out of that is less than 10%. And what the likes of Dangote and Honeywell got is a very small fraction. And maybe sometimes we don't talk about their contribution to the economy. Imagine today if we are still having to import cement, the naira will not even be at 700, maybe it will be at 1,000 naira. So when you see, industry that are trying to help the economy to develop, create employment, import substitution, foreign exchange earnings, they should be encouraged. So what we're asking government to do is to assess and evaluate incentive from that perspective and reduce the wasteful component of those incentives.
Is there ever a time where it gets to where, because of the global headwinds which we're facing now, where it becomes necessary to taper on those waivers? I mean, I'm not concentrating on the CIT, but even the VAT and all of that. Is there ever a time in an economy when the government will be forced, to look that way because of the issue of dwindling revenue?
The answer is yes. I do think that if government keeps an eye on those incentives, do a breakdown and ask yourself every time: do we need to continue with these waivers? For example, you have waiver on medical supplies and equipment. You have waivers on even military hardware. We're fighting a war technically. You have exemption, in different. Some of them are necessary. Some of them are necessary to promote, social well-being of the people, especially in a country where many people are poor. Many of them are necessary for government to help with exchange, rate, stability. Some of them with creating employment. But of course, I do agree. We have some of them that don't make a lot of sense, particularly the ones that are politically motivated. Um, where government will grant those incentives in a way that in itself distorts the workings of the market and the economy. Government needs to do that. I think that in a matter of time, I don't know how soon that will be, we'll get to a point where it will no longer be acceptable to subsidize fossil fuel. If at the same time Nigeria says we're doing energy transition to cleaner energy, what the rest of the world is doing is try to impose taxes on fossil fuel, apart from some small interventions now because of cost of living crisis. So we are doing the opposite. We're creating incentive for people to consume more fossil fuel. I think that will happen in a matter of time as soon as the economy stabilizes. But overall, government needs to pay attention to the fact that every 1 naira of incentive that we give should give us benefit that is more than 1 naira. If that is the case, then that makes sense. Or it could be that it's not giving us a benefit that is quantifiable, but it's helping us solve an important societal problem such as food security, affordability, cost of living, and the rest of that. I think it's that measurement of cost versus benefit that we need to do more regarding that.
So if the government goes ahead to take away the waivers, we had a guest yesterday who mentioned the issue of uncertainty. It might bring uncertainty to the system, but what does the country stand to lose if this issue of waivers goes the way of, okay, because we are in dire need of revenue now, no more waivers, at least to an extent. I know it can be total. What does the country stand to lose?
No, you can easily create a social crisis. So just imagine today we say we don't need waivers anymore on fuel products. So the price of diesel will go up immediately. Price of petrol and the subsidy government is paying will go up. You cannot say you don't want to give waiver on product coming from ECOWAS. That would be irresponsible for Nigeria to go against agreement they've agreed to. So some of it you can't really just wake up and say let's remove them. But then if you focus on how can we use incentive to stimulate more activities, in fact, the way government can make more money is by promoting more economic activities, and then you expand your tax base in the process. All of these tax incentives are big within our context, but it's just 4% of GDP. Our tax collection is around 6%. So put together, you have about 10%, when our collection should be in the region of 20%, which means a bigger component of the tax leakage we have in the system is due to compliance gap. And even sometimes non-compliance by even government MDAs themselves. So these areas are using technology for intelligence to ensure that the evasion is reduced. For me, are the biggest components that government needs to focus on. One other one I should mention is the road infrastructure tax credits, which is also included in this. But my view is actually maybe it's not even tax expenditure, because what the likes of Dangote, Nigeria LNG are doing is using money that they should use to pay tax to construct roads. And everybody refers to the Apapa road that Dangote constructed. Quality was better, cost was lower, it was completed faster. So if there's anything we should say, we should do more of that and be grateful to those companies doing that. Imagine that if the private sector had done Lagos-Ibadan Express Road, the pain that people are going through today, because government has been on it for 10 years, maybe that wouldn't have been the case. So overall, we need to be careful and strike the right balance when we are discussing about incentive rather than make it look like it's totally bad. I'm also not saying that we should continue to give more incentive. I'm saying we should be intentional and keep it under constant review to ensure that we're getting benefit for the money we spend.
Having this conversation, as you noted, if our tax net was wider than it is. So I believe it boils down to how do we expand that tax net and increase the number of active taxpayers, and then we will not be struggling and looking the other way.
Yes, indeed. The Governors Forum meeting recently, they said they collected about 1.67 trillion naira. All of the states in Nigeria, the IDR, 1.67 trillion naira, under 2 trillion. South Africa collected over 14 trillion naira equivalent from personal income tax alone. That's an economy that is less than 1/3 of our population. So there's really, and that's not because, there's a lot of waiver for individuals in paying taxes. It's just that you have a huge number of people that are not paying the right amount. Government themselves are creating a lot of confusion with multiplicity of taxes and multiplicity of collecting agencies. Many of them use consultants, huge leakages. I saw FRS also put out a notice recently saying MDA should not use consultants to collect taxes. But you see how these things are done is consultant is collecting the taxes, they're getting huge percentage, sometimes 20%, and these things are being shared. And who suffers? The economy suffers. So we need to be, very sincere with the Nigerian people. I don't think it's rocket science to increase our tax to GDP ratio and then use that for the purpose of the people. When you meet that social contract, in fact, people are less, eager to evade or avoid their taxes, and overall the economy and the people are better for it.
Yeah, and there's also the issue of compromise within the system. As you noted, some people do not pay what they're supposed to pay, and then you have, in the system, the compromise that allows that to go on.
Yes. The analogy I always say is that we say people should get, we should expand the tax net. And I say there are a lot of people in the tax net today, they're there with just one finger. So they tell you they're paying taxes, but they're paying 10,000 naira when they should indeed be paying billions. We even saw that recently with the elections. Some of the leading political parties asked for humongous amount of money for people who want to contest. And then one of the requirements was tax clearance certificate. And many of them had no tax clearance certificate, so they haven't even been paying. And then some of the tax authorities, which in my view was wrong, then gave them a nominal amount that they should pay so they can get the tax clearance certificate. So these are the issues, these are the fundamental issues we need to deal with. Use technology and tax intelligence, widen the tax net, ensure that you have one level, one agency of government collecting revenue per level of government, because that confusion and complication itself provides the avenue for leakages and corruption. When you deal with all of that, you suddenly find that these incentives that we are debating is a small percentage of the tax pie, which is giving us more benefits if we are intentional about it than the cost to the economy. And overall, maybe we have less to worry about. I saw in your previous session you were talking about debt. These are some of the reasons why we're having, debt spiraling out of control, because you really can't generate enough revenue to even meet your recurrent expenditure, let alone dealing with infrastructure and human capital development.
Yeah, and I guess as the country prepares to bring a new set of leaders, a new administration, these are some of the conversations that we should be having with these politicians who are coming out for the job. I mean, we should find out what's your plan in this area and this area. If we're dealing with debts, we're dealing with shrinking revenue, what's your plan, to improve in these areas?
Absolutely. That conversation, we don't have it enough in Nigeria. I read an article sometime. I was a UK article published in the UK, and the journalist was saying that if you wanted to get the attention of the people, you talk about entertainment and then you talk about tax. And I laughed. I said, if you talk about tax in Nigeria, you'll be on your own completely, because the people are not interested. The politicians don't understand it. They are not even compliant themselves. And then they promise us heaven and earth, and then they find out there's no way they can find the money. So what do? They start printing naira and they start borrowing, and then they make excuses for why they can't run the economy, right? almost every country in the world is facing challenges, but not all of them are struggling the way we are. So it has to be that there's a lot of things that we can do better that we are not doing. So the time to start asking the questions and making sure that our politicians are very, very clear. Don't say anything that is bogus. Tell us the practical steps that you will take. Demonstrate the understanding now. Let's interrogate it together. So at least we can have an idea of what we are getting into in the next 4 years, rather than just jumping in, hoping that everything will work out well. I don't think hope is a strategy. It hasn't worked for us for many years.
Yeah. Well, we need to thank you so much, Mr. Taiwo Idili, partner and tax leader with PwC, for sharing your thought this morning. We do hope that we talk and we learn and we put it into practice and move to the next stage. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.